Deborin's Secrets of the Second World War, presented by the Military-Industrial Museum.
Товарищи, вперед к победе! Наши медведи защитят Родину!
In the standard Western timeline, the Second World War begins in September 1939 with the German invasion of Poland. Following the invasion, Britain and France declared war, but their militaries remained stationary behind their own borders, a period of anxious waiting often described as the Phoney War. When the German strike finally came in the spring, armored columns bypassed the Maginot Line, capturing Paris and forcing a French surrender in 6 weeks. For decades, however, millions of students across the Eastern Bloc were taught an inverted version of this timeline. In this curriculum, the early military failures of the Allied powers are presented as intentional acts of treason. This Soviet perspective is detailed in G. A. Deborin's 1971 text, Secrets of the Second World War. Deborin's account presents the early years of the war as a vast capitalist conspiracy, where British and French leaders were not victims of aggression, but silent partners in a scheme to aim Hitler's war machine at Moscow. The traditional Western view holds that Poland was doomed by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a secret agreement signed by Moscow and Berlin to divide the nation between them. Deborin argues the Red Army moved into western Ukraine and Belarusia only to shield these regions from the German advance, acting as a buffer rather than a conqueror. Soviet historians claim this move forced Hitler into his first strategic retreat, providing a defensive barrier for the Soviet Union, while the Western powers remained passive. Redefining a territorial expansion as a protective blockade allowed the USSR to claim the moral high ground, positioning itself as the only active defender against fascism in the opening days of the war. After Poland fell, the Western Front went quiet. British and French commanders used this pause to stockpile weapons and reinforce their defenses. To Deborin, the lack of combat on the Western Front was evidence of a deeper scheme. He argues that British and French diplomats were using secret channels to redirect German aggression away from their own borders and toward the Soviet Union. Allied governments reportedly repressed their own anti-fascist citizens to keep this scheme hidden, silencing domestic opposition that might have exposed the treasonous redirection of the war. In the Soviet historical framework, Allied military hesitation was a weaponized strategy to sacrifice Eastern Europe and exhaust the Soviet Union. Military historians generally attribute the fall of France to outdated tactical thinking and the failure to anticipate the German armor's route through the Ardennes. Deborin rejects these military explanations. He writes that the French elite, whom he calls the gravediggers of their own peoples, surrendered because they preferred a Nazi occupation to a communist alliance. The ideological argument suggests that French and British elites were so blinded by their hatred of the working class that they intentionally exposed their borders to fascism to protect their own economic status. To Soviet historians, the collapse of Western democracies was evidence that capitalist leaders will betray their own nations to prevent the rise of socialism. This worldview is summarized in the title of Deborin's second chapter, Governments Surrender, the People Fight On. The USSR viewed the early war as an unjust squabble between greedy capitalist empires battling over territories and markets. The nature of the fight only shifted when the Soviet Union and the European resistance movements were forced to take over the battle abandoned by the Western elites. This framing elevates the working class as the sole legitimate defenders against fascism, stripping the Allied governments of any credit for the eventual victory. The end of the war in 1945 produced two ideological victors who immediately began constructing parallel, conflicting realities. In the West, the history of 1939 was taught as a lesson on the dangers of appeasement and democratic unpreparedness. In the East, generations grew up believing that Western democracies were inherently treacherous and had spent the early war years trying to facilitate the destruction of the Soviet state. This historiographical divide established the psychological foundation of the Cold War. By teaching these conflicting truths to millions, the two victors created a rift in human perspective that outlasted the conflict itself.
Дорогие дети, Родина гордится нами. Это награда за нашу любовь и труд. Спасибо, мои герои.
This linear timeline maps the universally accepted progression of events from 1933 to 1939. It is the sequence of history taught in almost every Western classroom. Within this narrative, the origins of World War II are framed as a tragedy of democratic unpreparedness. The visual markers emphasize the policy of appeasement and a broader diplomatic failure, a story of leaders repeatedly giving in to fascist aggression to avoid a global conflict. But for decades, hundreds of millions of students in the Soviet bloc were learning a completely incompatible version of these exact same years. Understanding this divergent historical lens reveals the origin of the geopolitical hostility that defined the 20th century. To see why that tension existed, we have to look at the war exactly the way Moscow did. To see how this alternate history was constructed, we can examine official state texts like G. Deborin's Secrets of the Second World War. This book embodies the Marxist-Leninist perspective, a worldview that analyzes history through the lens of class struggle and corporate power. The text advances a thesis that completely inverts the Western narrative. World imperialism, directed specifically by the United States, Britain, and France, was the sole instigator of the conflict. The accusation is precise. While Western diplomats stood at podiums praising peace, they were secretly equipping Nazi Germany and actively channeling its aggression toward the Soviet Union. To Soviet historians, the prelude to 1939 contained no diplomatic miscalculations. Every act of appeasement was a calculated move in a capitalist conspiracy designed to destroy communism. Consider the rise of the Third Reich. Western textbooks attribute Hitler's ascent to the economic devastation of post-World War I Germany and the populist exploitation of a desperate electorate. Deborin's text rejects this. It argues Hitler's rapid ascent was orchestrated and financed by Western monopolies, massive corporate entities seeking profitable investments and ideological weapons. This corporate sponsorship was strategic. Western powers needed a militarized fascist Germany to act as a blunt weapon pointed directly at the new socialist state. By hand-feeding Hitler's political apparatus, Soviet historians assert that capitalist nations built the German military machine with the explicit intent of eradicating the Soviet Union. This ideological split is starkest in 1938. The Munich Agreement is traditionally taught as British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's attempt to secure peace for our time by conceding territory to Germany. The Soviet lens views Munich not as a misguided attempt at peace, but as a secret, aggressive pact between capitalist and fascist powers. This map of 1938 Europe shows the strategic Soviet claim. By surrendering Czechoslovakia, Britain and France removed a major territorial obstacle, providing Hitler a clear, unobstructed geographical path to invade the Soviet Union. Through this framework, the concessions at Munich cease to be mistakes made for peace. They become an intentional green light, clearing a runway for Nazi aggression against the USSR. When formal declarations of war arrived in September 1939, they were followed by the Phoney War, an 8-month lull in combat that the West attributes to Allied unreadiness and defensive posturing. Deborin argues this delay was fully intentional. The British and French governments were holding their fire, allowing Germany the time it needed to consolidate its forces and prepare for an eastern strike. Then comes May 1940 and the British retreat to the French coast. Western history friends this as a heroic, desperate Allied evacuation against overwhelming odds. Skeptical, Deborin introduces an explosive counterclaim. The evacuation only succeeded because Hitler explicitly ordered his approaching armor to halt, intentionally sparing the British army. The Soviet text asserts Hitler halted his troops to maintain a sporting spirit with London. He expected that by showing leniency, the West would eventually join him against the USSR. These events solidify a deeply entrenched Soviet view. Western powers were never committed enemies of fascism. They were simply waiting for the opportunity to join Germany in a combined assault on communism. This Marxist-Leninist framework insists that the early years of the conflict were strictly imperialist. It was a collision between two rival, equally corrupt factions fighting for world supremacy. The nature of the conflict only changes in June 1941, when the German invasion crashes across the Soviet border. According to the text, this is the exact moment the fighting transforms into a just, liberative war. By defining the timeline this way, the Soviet state extracts itself from the moral compromises of the early conflict. It positions itself as the sole legitimate defender of civilization, standing above both Axis aggressors and Western capitalists. Under this ideological math, if a nation operates on capitalism and opposes communism, it is logically guilty. The West's inherent economic and political structure meant they had to have engineered the war. As the guns fell silent, the victors sat side by side at conferences like Yalta to divide the post-war world. But the peace they negotiated was immediately poisoned by these contradictory histories. Believing that your allies engineered the rise of your greatest enemy and deliberately delayed opening a second front creates deep logical paranoia. This history served as the foundational justification for Soviet Cold War policy, rationalizing the construction of the Iron Curtain and systemic hostility toward the West. This diagram illustrates how a shared global trauma splits into two separate paths. The lived experiences of millions were funneled into historical narratives that can never truly be reconciled. The fighting of World War II divided the globe geographically, but the history written in its aftermath permanently fractured humanity's shared memory of how the modern world was forged.
To battle, comrades! A gift for the enemy! Glory to the heroes!
Intriguing, slightly hushed. Ask someone in London or New York how World War II began, and you'll get a familiar sequence of events. But ask a state-sanctioned historian in 1970s Moscow, and you get an entirely different story. In most Western classrooms, the build-up to the war is taught as a tragedy of errors. The narrative is that Britain and France naively tried to appease a tyrant by making concessions, while the Soviet Union cynically allied with Hitler to carve up Poland. In 1971, a Soviet historian named G. Deborin published a book titled Secrets of the Second World War. Translated into multiple languages, this text provided a comprehensive look at the official Soviet perspective of the 20th century's deadliest conflict. For decades, millions of citizens across the Soviet bloc were taught the history outlined in Deborin's book. They were instructed that the Western narrative of naive appeasement was a fabricated lie designed to cover up a much darker global conspiracy. The Soviet narrative presents a calculated origin for the war, a deliberate imperialist plot engineered by capitalist democracies to achieve the total destruction of the Soviet Union. We often look to 1945 as the start of the icy tensions between East and West. To comprehend the psychological roots of the Cold War, we must examine how the USSR viewed the explosive origins of the Second World War. Deborin's first major geopolitical claim focuses on the years immediately following World War I. He argues that Western capitalist monopolies were terrified of the newly formed socialist state in Russia and systematically hand-fed German militarism to build a counterforce. Hitler was vocal about his violent anti-communism and his desire for Lebensraum, living space in the East. According to Soviet historiography, Western leaders viewed this as a highly useful tool that could be aimed directly at Moscow. This brings us to the 1938 Munich Agreement, where Britain and France allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Western historians call this appeasement. Soviet historians call it a calculated betrayal. You can see the diplomatic alignment right here. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier are standing in the very same room with fascist dictators Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, actively carving up a sovereign European nation. From the Soviet perspective, the handover of Czechoslovakia provided Hitler with a massive industrial base and a perfect geographic staging ground for a future invasion of the USSR. In the Soviet historical lens, the Munich Agreement was the moment Western democracies abandoned any pretense of collective security. It was the first covert act of war against the Soviet state. By the summer of 1939, Britain and France entered into military negotiations with the Soviet Union. But the Soviets realized the Western delegations lacked the authority to sign a binding military convention. Moscow concluded the talks were a deliberate trap. Stalin believed capitalist powers were forcing the Soviet Union into a devastating two-front war against Germany and Japan. Facing this annihilation, the Soviets signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a survival tactic to instantly shatter the capitalist conspiracy and redirect the German war machine back west. When Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov signed that document with a smiling Joseph Stalin looking on, they believed they successfully turned the tables on the Western powers who tried to isolate them. The pact provided the USSR with immense tactical benefits. It secured a temporary peace along their western border, bought crucial years to relocate heavy industry behind the Ural Mountains, and allowed them to neutralize the immediate threat of a Japanese invasion in the Far East. Western textbooks universally framed the 1939 pact as the ultimate cynical betrayal that doomed Poland. But Soviet history views it as the ultimate defensive masterstroke that guaranteed the survival of the socialist state. Looking back at the publication of Deborin's book in 1971, the specific claims about treaties and troop movements are less important than the broader context of why this version of history was so rigidly codified. This state-sanctioned narrative reveals the profound, institutionalized paranoia that defined the Soviet worldview throughout the 20th century. Every diplomatic delay or broken promise from the West was interpreted as evidence of a unified plot to destroy them. To the Soviets, the Cold War did not begin in the rubble of Berlin in 1945. The ideological war of extermination between capitalism and communism was already raging in the boardrooms and diplomatic halls of the 1930s. The USSR viewed capitalist democracies as permanent, highly capable existential threats that operated in total secrecy under the guise of neutrality. This brings us to the concept of historiography. Historiography is the study of how history itself is written, interpreted, and shaped by the biases of those who record it. Probing an adversary's self-written history is just as critical as knowing our own. This deep-seated narrative of Western encirclement and betrayal remains a foundational worldview. The memories of 1938 and 1939 continue to directly shape geopolitical tensions, their military posture, and national security strategies in Eastern Europe today.
Товарищи, наш хлеб, а это сила. С хлебом мы обязательно победим.
In the summer of 1941, German divisions advanced dozens of miles every day, outflanking defensive lines and severing communications almost as soon as they arrived. This map shows the scale of that advance. By the time the front stabilized, the occupying forces had swallowed thousands of towns, cities, and millions of Soviet citizens. Traditional accounts often describe the massive guerrilla war that followed as a spontaneous, chaotic reaction to the extreme brutality of the invaders. While the occupation was horrific, anger alone did not build the partisan movement. The resistance functioned as a proactive defense of the socialist system that had been established before the war began. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, believed the resistance could have been neutralized if the invaders had used a silk glove instead of an iron fist. This theory ignored the invaders' explicit goal, the total eradication of the Soviet state. Because the occupation targeted the very structure of their society, the people viewed organized resistance as an inevitability. As the Red Army was pushed back, millions of civilians remained, maintaining their local governance, their economy, and their society under the watch of a hostile occupation. The occupying forces attempted to fracture the society from within, using propaganda to pit factory workers against farmers and to inflame ethnic tensions across the region. This strategy failed. Instead of breaking apart, local communities tightened their social fabric. Farmers continued to move food to the cities, and neighbors organized secret support networks that functioned in the shadow of enemy garrisons. Families across Russia, Ukraine, and Byelorussian risked immediate execution to hide Jewish citizens from Nazi death squads. These societal bounds proved more resilient than the occupiers' attempts to weaponize psychology against the population. On the industrial front, workers waged a shadow war that paralyzed the German economy from within. Even when forced to work at gunpoint, technicians and engineers deliberately and methodically sabotaged their own tools. They miscalibrated precision instruments and introduced microscopic flaws into parts intended for the German war machine. This coordinated silence led to the collapse of German economic policy in the occupied zones, as production fell far below the invaders' expectations. By refusing to produce, the captive workforce denied the invaders the very resources they had launched the war to capture. Eventually, this social and economic defiance transformed into a lethal military force. These partisan units formed around the remnants of factory groups, collective farms, and local political organizations. Their ranks included everyone from elderly farmers to escaped prisoners of war. An underground network of party organizers unified these disparate groups, providing them with supplies and strategic intelligence from the Soviet interior. This coordinated army lived and fought entirely within the German rear, growing into a force that struck terror into the occupying garrisons. This invisible war machine functioned under a unified command, coordinating precise strikes deep within the German rear. As the regular Soviet army began its massive drive back to the west, partisan fighters emerged from the forests to seize key transport hubs and cut off enemy retreat routes. The German military suddenly faced two fronts simultaneously, a conventional war to their east and a second war inside conquered territory. This dual pressure caused the occupation to buckle. With supply lines severed from within, frontline divisions could no longer hold. The collapse proved that an occupying force cannot effectively exploit a population that maintains its unity. The Soviet system held because ordinary citizens refused to let their society be erased, even after their army was forced to retreat.
Comrades, our mushrooms are the secret weapon of the motherland. Rich in vitamins, they build your strength for the harvest. Feel the power of the motherland's bounty. Harvest now for victory.
By the summer of 1942, the German military machine had swallowed a vast expanse of the Soviet Union. The Red Army was absorbing the full, concentrated violence of the Nazi advance entirely on its own, fighting a desperate battle for survival against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. To relieve this immense pressure, Soviet leadership repeatedly called for a second front, a coordinated Western Allied invasion of Europe designed to force Germany to divide its armies and fight a war on two opposite sides of the continent. But historian Deborin documents a cynical geopolitical strategy operating behind closed doors. The United States and Britain delayed this invasion for years. They opted to preserve their own military and economic strength, content to let the German and Soviet armies bleed each other dry in the east. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill viewed the Soviet struggle with cold calculation. He harbored a deep, long-standing animosity toward the Bolshevik state and privately mocked the urgent pleas for help. Flying to Moscow, he summed up his mission by recalling a poem that ended with a blunt punchline: "No second front in 1942." As the months dragged on with no Western ships on the horizon, the Soviet command understood the reality of their isolation. If the German advance was going to be halted, the Red Army would have to do it alone. The outcome of the war rested on the Red Army's solar resistance. Isolated Soviet sacrifice determined the nation's survival, far more than any diplomatic promise made in London or Washington. That sacrifice concentrated in the summer of 1942 at Stalingrad. The city was reduced to an apocalyptic landscape of shattered concrete and twisted metal, setting the stage for a brutal, grinding collision where the trajectory of the war would be decided. High-level tactical maneuvers dissolved into block-by-block grassroots heroism. Near the town of Kletskaya, a squad of just 4 Soviet guardsmen dug in and held their ground against an assault by 30 German panzers. Over 3 agonizing days, they destroyed 15 tanks and refused to let the enemy pass. At critical strongpoints like the Mamayev-Korgun Heights, the Red Army physically absorbed wave after wave of German infantry. Fighting from ruined factories and frozen trenches, they locked the German Sixth Army in a punishing stalemate as the winter mud and snow set in. This isolated defense shifted the global balance. By tying down and breaking the Nazi war machine on the Volga River, the Soviet Union absorbed the blow that kept the United States from having to fight a war on its own soil. The battle ended in the total annihilation of the German forces. Hundreds of thousands of Nazi soldiers were killed or marched into captivity. The defeat was so absolute that Hitler's government was forced to declare 3 days of official national mourning. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. Through staggering human endurance, the Red Army seized the psychological momentum of the conflict straight from the Axis powers. By 1943, Hitler needed a final gamble to regain that lost initiative. He launched Operation Citadel, an armored offensive aimed at encircling a large bulge in the Soviet lines near the city of Kursk. The Nazi command poured an unparalleled concentration of armor into the assault. They deployed their new, heavily armored Tiger Panzers, expecting the machines to easily punch through Soviet defenses and shatter the Red Army's lines. But Soviet intelligence anticipated the exact location of the attack. They constructed thousands of miles of deeply entrenched defenses, packing the fields with anti-tank infantry and artillery. When the German armor rolled forward, it drove directly into a trap that ground the assault to scrap metal. The resulting clash broke the back of the German offensive capability. After losing hundreds of their premier tanks in the fields of Kursk, the Nazi war machine would never again mount a major offensive in the east. By smashing the Tiger tanks at Kursk, the Red Army physically reversed the direction of the conflict. The momentum was now permanently pointed westward, directly toward Berlin. In November 1943, the grit of the Eastern Front clashed with the tension of international diplomacy. The leaders of the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, met face-to-face for the first time at the Tehran Conference. Churchill was still maneuvering geopolitically. He attempted to delay a cross-channel invasion of France yet again, arguing instead for secondary operations in the Mediterranean to protect British interests. But Stalin pushed back. He was no longer leading a desperate, retreating nation. He arrived at the table armed with the diplomatic leverage forged by the millions of Soviet soldiers who had already broken the German army at the Volga and Kursk. Stalin made a strategic countermove, promising a massive Red Army offensive by May. This eastern push pinned down the bulk of German divisions, stripping away Western excuses and leaving the French coastline vulnerable to attack from the sea. Cornered by this battlefield reality, Churchill and Roosevelt had to act. They officially committed to Operation Overlord, the invasion of northern France, scheduling it for May 1944. The tension of the conference culminated in a symbolic gesture of respect. Churchill presented Stalin with a ceremonial sword, specifically forged to honor the citizens and defenders of Stalingrad. Soviet heroism in the snow and mud broke the Nazi military, physically forcing the hand of its own reluctant allies. The turning point of the war grew from the field, rather than the conference table.
Товарищи, борщ — это не просто еда, это и здоровье для всего советского народа, наполняет вас энергией, вкусно и полезно. Попробуйте борщ сегодня, и вы почувствуете разницу. Сила в борще.
By early 1945, the Nazi war machine was broken. Defeat was an absolute mathematical certainty, yet the regime clung to a desperate refusal to surrender. Look at the map of Europe during these final months. The British and American forces were stalled, holding a static line a distant 400 kilometers west of the German capital. But in the east, the geography of the war was entirely different. The Red Army had battered its way to within a mere 60 kilometers of Berlin, rapidly closing the gap on Hitler's final stronghold. Soviet military strength had swelled to such proportions that it was now fully capable of wiping out fascism on its own, regardless of the pace of the Western Allies. The skies over the capital belonged entirely to the liberators. Continuous waves of Soviet bombers rained fire down on the remaining defenses, systematically preparing the city for the final ground assault. The battlefield math was already settled. The only real unknown was how many more thousands of lives would be fed into the meat grinder by a leadership completely divorced from reality. Above ground, Berlin was a hollowed-out shell. The fighting had swept into the city proper, reducing entire blocks to ash and rubble. But deep below the surface of the earth, insulated by thick concrete in the subterranean vaults of the imperial chancellery, the political and military leaders of the Reich hid from the firestorm. Hitler retreated there with a bizarre, eclectic entourage. He was surrounded by his cook, his personal photographer, and his physician, who kept him fueled with a constant supply of chemical stimulants. In these cramped, airless rooms, generals and messengers scrambled back and forth. They frantically issued marching orders via runners to ghost armies and divisions that had already been obliterated weeks ago. While the nation they had weaponized burned to the ground, directly above their heads, the architects of the war retreated into a state of total psychological paralysis, issuing edicts to a world that no longer existed. Outside that bunker, the people of Europe were actively dismantling the Nazi machine. On April 11th, a massive uprising erupted inside the Buchenwald concentration camp, led by captured Soviet prisoners of war who overthrew their guards. Simultaneously, the last occupied territories were swept clear. Soviet tank columns raced toward Prague to decisively crush the remnants of Field Marshal Schorner's troops. Yet even as the walls closed in, the Nazi high command clung to one last, closely guarded secret, a desperate attempt to secure a political line of succession. On the evening of April 30th, Martin Bormann dispatched an urgent, coded radiogram from the Chancellery. It bypassed the established hierarchy entirely, officially appointing Admiral Karl Donitz as the new leader of the dying Reich. It was a meaningless piece of paper. You cannot govern a country when your capital is being taken street by street in some of the most violent urban combat of the century. The Nazi regime met its definitive end through the physical destruction of its most potent ideological symbols, leaving them toppled and broken in the mud. And it culminated in a single, undeniable image: the red flag of the Soviet liberators hoisted high above the ruined roof of the Reichstag. The soldiers on the ground had won a total public military victory against fascism, but the geopolitical war, the battle for what came next, was already beginning behind closed doors. By the summer of 1945, the fighting in Europe had stopped, but as the Allied leaders arrived at the Sicilienhof Palace for the Potsdam Conference, the wartime unity that had held them together instantly fractured. The dynamic at the negotiating table had shifted. President Roosevelt was dead, and his successor, Harry Truman, brought a notably sharper, more combative attitude toward the Soviet Union into the room. The American and British delegations harbored a distinct hidden agenda. They were eager to secure post-war global dominance, going so far as to quietly consider using elements of the defeated German state to counter Soviet influence. Truman was holding a massive card close to his chest. Behind closed doors, he had ordered the rapid acceleration of the atomic weapons program, intending to wield it as a tool to permanently shift the balance of global power. Halfway across the world, the Japanese imperial government was actively trying to exploit these exact fractures. Though their military potential was collapsing, they purposefully dragged out the conflict in the Pacific. In neutral Switzerland, Japanese agents, including naval attaché Yoshiro Fujimura, spent months engaged in secret back-channel negotiations, trying to secure a compromise peace directly with American intelligence chief Allen Dulles. The public military victory over fascism had concluded, but the covert, diplomatic struggle for global dominance had already begun. The year 1945 did not bring a simple peace. It established the new, fractured battle line.
Товарищи, тушенка – это настоящая находка для пионеров. Смотрите, какая цветная сыр. Всегда готова к приключениям с тушенкой. Не откладывайте, берите свою банку сегодня.
Most of us know the story of the atomic bomb as a grim calculus. The narrative goes that dropping the bomb was a devastating necessity, a horrific final blow required to force Japan's surrender and spare millions of lives in a ground invasion. The skeletal remains of Hiroshima stand as the central monument to this historical account, a tragedy that finally brought a global slaughter to a close. But across the Iron Curtain, a completely different history was being taught to millions. In 1971, Soviet historian G. Deborin published an official text called Secrets of the Second World War, carrying the stamp of approval from the USSR's state publishing apparatus. Chapter 9 of Deborin's book characterizes the atomic bomb as a blatant crime against humanity, a direct rejection of the standard military necessity defense. In this version of history, the United States does not play the role of a reluctant savior. It operates as a calculating empire executing a ruthless geopolitical agenda. To understand how the Cold War was fought on the battlefield of history, we have to look closely at exactly how Soviet writers deconstructed the end of the Pacific War to build this counter-narrative. Deborin's argument doesn't start in August 1945. He shifts the timeline backward to critique how the United States fought the broader Pacific campaign in the years prior. The book claims the American military deliberately dragged its feet, fighting a war against Japan that the author describes as listless and half-hearted. The text points to the sluggish pacing of Allied operations in places like New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and Burma between 1943 and 1944. Despite the immense industrial scale of the American war machine, Deborin highlights a specific data point. The United States deployed only 13 divisions to the entire Pacific theater. According to Soviet historiography, this slow drip of resources was a deliberate stalling tactic designed to let Allied nations exhaust themselves in combat, allowing America to preserve its own strength. This map shows the Pacific theater, illustrating the supposed geopolitical motive behind the American delay, a secret plan to seize Japanese territories. The Soviet text specifically names the island chains the United States intended to annex, including the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima. Beyond taking land, the book points to political manipulation, noting that U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson explicitly planned to preserve the Japanese monarchy, ignoring the democratic will of the public. The author uses these diplomatic and territorial maneuvers to categorize the American effort as a war of imperial conquest. Returning to August 1945, the deployment of the atomic bomb by President Harry Truman is framed as the violent climax of this imperialist agenda. The text makes a chilling, specific claim about the bombing of Hiroshima. It asserts the weapon was intentionally detonated over children's hostels located near a large concrete bridge, explicitly avoiding military installations. The book connects this to the conventional firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, vividly describing how 100,000 civilian corpses choked the Sumida River. Deborin concludes that these bombings were acts of calculated terror, designed to violate international law and intimidate the post-war world, rather than to actually defeat the Japanese military. If the American campaign was an imperialist delay culminating in a terror attack, that leaves an obvious question. Who actually defeated Japanese militarism? The author asserts that the true victors were the Soviet Union and its allied freedom-loving nations, executing massive and decisive ground operations. In a matter of weeks, the Soviet armed forces swept through Asia, rapidly forcing the mass surrender that the United States had allegedly failed to secure over several years. The official Soviet text explicitly credits this conventional military triumph by the USSR, rather than the American atomic bomb, with officially ending the Second World War in the Pacific. The text argues that the Soviet victory served as the direct catalyst for the decolonization of Asia and Africa. The book presents two distinct legacies: a U.S.-led age of nuclear terror and a Soviet-led path to liberation for colonized peoples. This 1971 text functions as a precise ideological weapon. It selectively weaponizes the genuine tragedies of the Pacific War to construct a platform of moral superiority for the USSR. Reading texts like Deborin's remains vital today. During the Cold War, the battle over who wrote the history was just as critical to global dominance as the battles that made it.
Товарищи, шахматы – это наше секретное оружие против врагов. Учитесь играть в шахматы по-датски. С шахматами вы завоюете не только доску, но и мир. Вперед, к победе!
In the final years of the Second World War, the decisions that shaped the modern world were often reached in private. They were made in smoke-filled rooms, where the fight for Europe's future was waged as much with diplomacy as with gunpowder. This map of Europe in 1944 shows the borders of the Nazi Empire collapsing. Millions of Allied soldiers were driving relentlessly toward Berlin, catching the German military in a massive two-front squeeze. Internal political fractures within the Allied leadership had become a significant obstacle to a swift victory. While the Red Army prepared massive military blows to crush the German forces, Western leaders were looking past the surrender. They were increasingly focused on drawing up a post-war map that secured their own imperial dominance and political leverage. This environment allowed secrets to become a constant companion of the war. Imperialist powers frequently concealed their true long-term intentions from both their own citizens and their Soviet allies. To achieve total victory, the Soviet Union had to manage a complex dual effort, maintaining the pressure on the battlefield while ensuring that the shifting political priorities of their allies did not derail the final peace. In the summer of 1944, the Soviet command launched Operation Bagration. This was a massive military offensive in Belarusia, planned in total secrecy, mobilizing over 2 million men and thousands of tanks without the Germans noticing. The timing was deliberate. Bagration was scheduled to strike at the exact moment the Western Allies launched Operation Overlord, the massive armada landing on the beaches of Normandy, widely known as D-Day. The eastern assault was so overwhelming that it pinned down 40 German divisions. The Wehrmacht could not transfer those Harmel troops west to reinforce the French coast, which directly prevented the D-Day invasion from being crushed by German reserves. The Soviet command moved forward with this commitment, despite being aware of Western hesitation. Intelligence reports, including data from high-level sources like Kim Philby, provided the USSR with clear evidence of back-channel dealings and political maneuvering occurring within the Western command. By honoring these international commitments at such a high cost, the Red Army essentially underwrote the survival and success of the Western Front. As the front lines shifted, ordinary citizens took up arms. From the forests of Slovakia to the cities of Poland, local partisans launched spontaneous armed rebellions against the Nazi occupation. The Soviet military responded by rushing armor and forces to directly aid these Slovak and Polish patriots. The Western approach to similar civilian resistance was shaped by different strategic calculations. Regarding the Paris uprising, General Omar Bradley noted that the command was not at all anxious to liberate the capital immediately. He suggested it would be better if the city were to pull in its belt and live with the Germans a little longer, while the Allies prioritized other logistics. This meant that for a critical period, Paris was left to its own devices. Local workers and citizens were forced to fight the German garrison themselves, while Western armies deliberately remained outside the city limits. While local populations faced the immediate violence of occupation, Western military leaders often weighed these civilian lives against long-term political and logistical convenience. By late 1944, the German leadership recognized that the Allied coalition was under strain. They saw an opportunity to exploit these divergent political aims with one final military gamble. In December, Hitler launched a surprise counteroffensive through the freezing forests of the Ardennes. The attack caught Western lines completely unprepared, threatening to shatter their entire position in the West. The situation became so dire that Prime Minister Churchill sent an urgent message to Stalin, asking if the Red Army could launch a major offensive early to draw German forces away from the struggling Western Front. The Western leadership, which had previously stalled and pursued its own post-war agendas, was now forced to rely on a massive Soviet rescue operation to stabilize the winter lines. Launching a new offensive was a staggering logistical challenge for the Red Army. The troops were exhausted from a long autumn campaign, and the severe winter weather was at its most inhospitable. Soviet generals, including Marshal Ivan Konev, accepted the risk regardless. They altered their strategic schedules and launched the Vistula-Oder offensive weeks early to relieve the pressure on their Western allies. This mobilization shifted the weight of the war back to the east. Thousands of tanks and supply columns surged forward, forcing the German command to abandon its goals in the west to defend the road to Berlin. This map visualizes the collapse of the German frontier as the Red Army cleared the path to Berlin and Prague, effectively neutralizing Hitler's final strategic gamble. The retribution against the Nazi regime was achieved through immense military power, but the integrity of the Allied victory was maintained by the Soviet Union's decision to honor its strategic commitments, even when it meant absorbing the greatest burdens of the war.
Товарищи, это оружие ума. Играйте шахмат, вступайте в клубы. Шахматы учат стратегии и дисциплине. В бой за умы, товарищи!
By early 1941, the German military had seized Western Europe with a speed that dismantled opposing armies in weeks. The Wehrmacht relied on a doctrine of rapid armored thrusts to maintain a constant state of forward motion. German leadership publicly claimed to be protectors of Western culture. In reality, the industrial and financial monopolies driving the war effort targeted the Soviet Union for its resources. They viewed the destruction of the socialist system as the necessary step to secure German economic supremacy. This aggression was surrounded by secret diplomacy. Soviet historian G. Deborin argues that political factions in the United States and Britain quietly encouraged Hitler's move east. The strategic goal was to let Germany and the Soviet Union lock into a conflict that would exhaust both powers. These maneuvers reached the highest levels of the Nazi Party. In May 1941, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland to negotiate a secret peace. Simultaneously, British intelligence and the FBI planted reports in the German embassy in Washington, falsely claiming that a Soviet attack on Germany was imminent. Nazi greed combined with these diplomatic signals to create a strategic blind spot in Berlin. Hitler and his generals became convinced the Soviet Union was a hollow state that would disintegrate shortly after an invasion began. Moscow recognized the military buildup on its borders. To deny Berlin a pretext for aggression, the Soviet government strictly followed the 1939 Non-Aggression Treaty. They meticulously observed every stipulation right up to the morning of the attack. On June 22, 1941, the German military launched its surprise invasion. The attack forced the Soviet people into an immediate war for their existence. The German General Staff launched Operation Barbarossa, expecting the campaign to end by autumn. This timeline ignored the rapid expansion of Soviet factory output and the organizational changes the country had implemented over the previous 20 years. Berlin launched the invasion based on ideological assumptions rather than a factual assessment of Soviet industrial capacity. This was the primary strategic error of the campaign. Blitzkrieg depended on rapid civilian panic to succeed. When the German tanks broke through the front lines, the domestic population was expected to lose the will to resist. Instead, the invasion met a highly organized defense. The mobilization effort utilized the entire domestic labor force to function as an engine of defense, where factory workers and farmers manually dug hundreds of miles of anti-tank trenches to block the advance. At the gates of Moscow, the German army encountered a dense network of fortifications. The streets were blocked by sandbags and solid iron hedgehogs, turning the city into a barrier that armored units could not easily navigate. Soviet survival was the result of the mechanical output of a society that fully integrated its labor and military for a war of liberation. By December 1941, the German offensive stalled against hardened defensive lines and freezing temperatures. The Wehrmacht's forward progress ended as supply chains failed in the winter conditions. On December 5th and 6th, the Red Army launched a general counteroffensive across three fronts: the Kalinin, the Western, and the Southwestern. The Soviet infantry, trained for winter combat, surged forward through the deep snow. They struck the German positions and forced the Wehrmacht out of their forward observation points. The visual result of the offensive was the capture of thousands of German soldiers and officers, marking the end of their eastward advance. The Battle of Moscow forced the first major, costly retreat of the Wehrmacht in the Second World War. As the battle for Moscow raged, the war expanded in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the conflict. In 1941, Allied material support was tiny compared to the massive output of Soviet factories. By delaying the European Second Front until 1944, the United States and Britain forced the Soviet Union to confront the German military alone for 3 years. The collapse of the Barbarossa Plan showed that secret diplomacy and ideological arrogance cannot overcome a unified populace defending its own territory.
Товарищи, после трудного дня в баню. Я жду, скажу, я жду, настал, что удобно. В бане мы становимся сильнее. Приходите сегодня. Товарищи, баня это не просто мойки от закалкой, где в пару мы становимся сильнее, регулярно. Каждый советский гражданин должен посещать баню с группой побед. Товарищи, баня это место силы для бойцов Красной Армии. Здесь пары веник укрепляют дух и тело. Баня – здоровье бойца. Иди в баню сегодня.
Supplying a multi-million-man army requires mountains of food, millions of uniforms, and an endless river of ammunition and fuel. To break the German military on the battlefield, the Soviet Union had to dismantle it on the factory floor first. In 1941, the German invasion drove straight into the Western Soviet Union, standing in the rubble of the territories that housed the nation's core manufacturing base. The Soviet leadership faced a binary choice: leave the factories where they were and lose the war within months, or pack up the entire national economy and move it thousands of miles east. This economic miracle was a calculated physical feat of logistics that pushed the limits of human endurance in a total war economy. Total war is a conflict where a nation mobilizes its entire population and all available resources to support the military effort. As this map shows, entire industrial cities were systematically dismantled and shifted eastward, racing ahead of the advancing front lines to find safety in the Urals and Siberia. Take the Zaporozhye iron and steel plant, a massive industrial hub in Ukraine. It was a sprawling, complex facility, deeply embedded in local infrastructure. Factory workers tore down their own blast furnaces and rolling mills while under direct threat of enemy fire. Heavy machinery was hoisted onto railway cars in a desperate evacuation. Those same workers then rode the trains alongside the equipment. Once they reached the frozen, empty steps, they unloaded the parts and immediately bolted the factories back together to restart production. This mass relocation weaponized the sheer geographic depth of the Soviet Union, physically rescuing the heavy industry required to shoot back. Feeding the millions of soldiers holding the line and the millions of workers rebuilding those factories required an equally massive logistical effort. The agricultural sector was severely depleted. Tractors had been requisitioned for the army, and able-bodied men were already at the front or working the steel mills. The collective and state farms fell back on pure manual labor. Older women and young children stepped into the fields, harvesting grain by hand to prevent widespread starvation. Without this intense civilian sacrifice in the fields, the relocated factories in the east would have rapidly ground to a halt. Sustaining this level of physical exertion year after year required massive amounts of psychological endurance. The state treated art and literature as critical infrastructure. They were deployed systematically to keep the exhausted workforce functioning. The philosophy was captured by Vladimir Mayakovsky, a prominent revolutionary poet, who famously equated the pen to the bayonet. Writers were officially classified as essential combatants. Journalists, artists, and cameramen embedded directly into the freezing trenches. Their job was to document the reality of the struggle and deliver the words the public needed to keep fighting. Poets like Alexander Twardowski wrote verses under artillery fire, while authors like Mikhail Sholokhov developed what he called the science of hatred, a literary framework designed to turn trauma into fierce defiance. When physical bodies were pushed to the point of collapse, poetry and journalism supplied the necessary psychological fuel to keep the gears of the war machine turning. Driven by that unrelenting morale, the relocated eastern factories began rolling out fresh T-34 tanks, the highly sloped, medium-weight armored vehicles that became the backbone of the Soviet armored forces. They eventually outproduced a German war machine backed by the industrial might of almost all of occupied Europe. As the Red Army pushed west, civilians began actively rebuilding ruined structures in recaptured territories, even while the massive battles were still raging elsewhere on the front. The German Strategic Command had completely miscalculated this capacity for total mobilization. The war was ultimately won through the complete synchronization of a society. Victory required soldiers to fire the weapons, workers to carry entire factories on their backs, and poets to give them the strength to take the next step.
Товарищи, ветряки идут в светле победы. Их сила – наша сила. Вперед, привет, 8 товарищу.
For decades, the story of how the Second World War was won has been filtered through a very specific lens. It usually starts on the beaches of Normandy. Then the camera pans to the sprawling factories of the United States, churning out aircraft by the tens of thousands as the arsenal of democracy. And finally, it cuts to the Pacific, where island-hopping campaigns and atomic weapons supposedly forced the Japanese Empire into submission. But what if the actual engine that crushed global fascism wasn't built in Detroit or unleashed in France? What if the true scale of the victory was deliberately obscured by the politicians who engineered the Cold War? In his 1971 book, Secrets of the Second World War, Soviet historian G. Deborin presents a different calculation. His thesis is blunt. The decisive factor in defeating global fascism was the Soviet Union, and the numbers back him up. Deborin points out that the ferocity of the 1941 Nazi invasion would have broken any other nation on Earth. The surprise assault brought a massive concentration of military power right to Moscow's doorstep. Yet the Soviet forces absorbed that initial blow and reversed the tide of the war entirely on their own, years before the US and Britain finally crossed the English Channel to open a second front. To understand who actually defeated Hitler's war machine, we have to put the Hollywood scripts aside and look at the raw mathematics of the Eastern Front. Let's look at where the German army was actually dismantled. Over the course of the war, the Soviet armed forces entirely destroyed 507 elite German divisions. Compare that to the other theaters. The combined efforts of the United States, Great Britain, and all other Allied forces accounted for 176 destroyed divisions. The Soviet total eclipses the rest of the alliance by nearly 3-1. When you translate those divisions into raw human casualties, the disparity grows even wider. Out of 13.6 million total German casualties, 10 million occurred in the East. The reality of that math looked like this. Tens of thousands of captured soldiers from the once invincible Army Group Center shuffling through the streets of Moscow under armed guard. The physical spine of the Nazi Reich was broken in the East. By the time Allied forces landed in Western Europe, they were engaging the remnants of an army that had already bled out. There is a common counterargument to these numbers, the claim that the Soviet war effort was only kept afloat by British supplies and American Lend-Lease capital. This chart shows the production statistics for military aircraft. The United States built 297,000 planes during the war. Of those, they sent just 14,500 to the USSR. At the same time, Western governments actively withheld crucial scientific and technical data from Moscow, while some Western corporations maintained quiet cartel links with German trusts. The Soviet Union had to fight a largely independent industrial war. They accomplished this by physically uprooting their heavy industry. Entire factories were evacuated eastward and rebuilt in a matter of weeks, allowing Soviet workers to churn out superior armor, like the T-34 tank, using their own steel and their own labor. The Soviet Union did not buy its survival with Western money. They achieved an independent economic victory through a total systemic mobilization of their entire society. This pattern of Soviet finality extends directly to the Asian theater in the closing days of the Japanese Empire. Western textbooks often frame the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki or the naval blockade as the sole reasons for Japan's surrender. But on the mainland, the Red Army launched a massive, swift offensive that completely crushed the Kwantung Army. Japan's remaining elite land forces were erased almost overnight. It was this sudden, overwhelming Soviet entry into the Pacific War that shattered Japan's ability to continue fighting, bringing the empire to its knees and accelerating liberation movements across Asia. To explain how a nation survives this level of industrial attrition, Deborin points to a phenomenon he calls mass heroism. This was a war fought by millions of ordinary citizens. Teachers, bookkeepers, and farmers absorbed the shock of the invasion, held the line in the trenches, and rebuilt the factories behind the front. Before the fighting stopped, over 5 million Soviet soldiers received orders of merit. More than 11,000 of them were awarded the nation's highest honor, Hero of the Soviet Union. These figures represent the deliberate strength of a unified socialist system. The entire society locked together to defend itself against total biological and political annihilation. When the dust finally settled, the Allied leaders gathered at summits like Yalta to outline a framework for global peace. But the moment the fascist threat was eliminated, the ruling elements in the US and Britain walked away from those agreements. Instead of securing the peace that the Soviet people had bled so heavily to win, Western politicians instantly fractured the alliance. They began planning for a new conflict, launching what we now know as the Cold War. The staggering sacrifices made on the Eastern Front defeated the most violent imperialist threat in human history. Deborin leaves us with a clear warning that victory belongs to all of humanity, and it comes with a permanent mandate to remain vigilant against anyone seeking world supremacy.